2012 proved to be the most successful year for FSOL Digital yet, with an incredibly popular pair of environments and From the Archives albums. 2013, however, took things on a left turn, with a large number of releases but none by FSOL. Welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London, and this week we'll be looking at everything that came out in 2013. And we start with Blackhill Transmitter EP, release date 1st of August 2013. I love the idea of narrative and continuity, and I really enjoy watching an artist develop their work. Part of the reason I started writing the text for a blog that ended up being part of this video series was to tell the story of Brian and Gaz's music, with each release and transmission gradually feeding into the next. This was fairly easy from 1987 to 2008, despite a late 90s question mark and a bit of a reset button in 2006, but by the end of 2012 it had become several concurrent stories: the Environment series, the From the Archive series, and the Amorphous Androgynous. 2013 started very quietly on the FSOL Digital front, with word of new music on the horizon but no releases or transmissions for the first 7 months. And then on the 1st of August, 4 EPs changed that, each under a new alias. Unlike the 2007 side projects, which in hindsight feel like experiments, largely Brian dipping his toe into the water as a way towards a new FSOL sound, these 4 projects stand on their own. And so yet another strand comes into the story. From here onwards, this series will be less a singular narrative and more a collection of then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Blackhill Transmitter then. Named after the Blackhill transmitting station in North Lanarkshire where Brian's father once worked, it's a very focused project documenting the transmitter, the old broadcasts it sent, and the stark landscape surrounding it. The idea of old transmissions brings to mind the hauntology approach of past Electric Brainstorm mixes, and the cover's faded artwork does a good job of visualising this. Musically, the theme is conveyed pretty well. It's fairly minimal in its approach, with crumbly granular synth textures, stark acoustic drum loops, EMS synthy sweeps, and the occasional electric guitar, a mixture of modern digital noise and retro live performance. Not entirely dissimilar to the elements of the Woodlands of Old and Environments 4 stylistically, with a similar bleak mood to 4 Forests, it's frequently abstract and very atmospheric. Much like the EMS Piano EP released at the same time, it was the death of Brian's father, Bill, that inspired the start of Blackhill Transmitter, as a tribute to his late father. Also, with FSOL moving in melancholic ambient acoustic territory, there was a desire to shift into something darker, particularly taking on a krautrock influence, which rears its head, especially in some of the later EPs. Unlike most FSOL digital releases from the previous few years, most of the tracks play with gaps between, with only a couple of subtle crossfades. 2 tracks would later feature on the Blackhill Transmitter LP. 527. 527 introduces the Blackhill Transmitter project in a fitting manner with a beautiful textural drone piece. Likely created using granular synthesis, the overall sound is somewhat lo-fi with a tape-like hissing texture adding a real sense of warmth despite the track's digital origins. More digital sounding rattles and sweeps come in during the final minute, keeping the piece from feeling too simplistic. Tower. An acoustic drum loop plays in a huge reverb chamber for this monolithic track. Forlorn synths drone in the background, deep bass rumbles, and krautrocky electric guitar buzzes away in the second half. The drums cut out before the end, leaving abstract lonely texture to fade away to silence. A wonderfully evocative piece. Landslide, also known as Landslides. Abstract granular synthesis once more, with rattling and droning sounds as well as occasionally odd gurgling noises. One of the most abstract Blackhill Transmitter pieces, but still retaining the project's remote Scottish landscape atmospherics. Carmin Line, also known as Carman Line. Beautiful ambience on this track, largely consisting of guitar and synth drones. While keeping in line with the stark nature of other Blackhill Transmitter material, its major key chords lend it a sense of optimism rarely found in the project. The second half of the EP version removes the main drones, focusing entirely on field recordings and background textures. The bulk of this is removed on the album version. Intriguingly, the title on the EP version, Car Mainline, is the name of the boundary between Earth and space, but it has been since renamed Car Mainline. TXDSO Stage 1. The first Blackhill Transmitter EP returns to rhythms with TXDSO Stage 1, named after the date of the first digital television switchover. The Blackhill transmitting station was the final station in the UK to cease broadcasting analogue television. The piece opens with an acoustic drum loop and synth noises before a lo-fi drum machine and analogue synth bass join the piece, bringing in a very 70s sound. Synth chords eventually build with EMS synthy sweeps and sinister piano notes in the background, adding a folk horror vibe. Purple. More abstract granular synthesis from Blackhill Transmitter. Starting out as a shimmering and tinkling sound, the piece gradually grows with hissing background noise and oscillating synth pulses. Black Grain. The first Blackhill EP closes on more abstraction, with throbbing digital sounds speeding up and slowing down, bit-crushed noise and other unusual sounds fading away to silence, as if hearing the final remnants of the transmitter's last analogue broadcast dissipating into the atmosphere. EMS Piano 1. Release date 1st of August 2013. One of the mainstays of the Electric Brainstorms, with tracks appearing on 4 of the mixes, the first EMS Piano release eventually came out 5 years after the project was first announced. With tracks labelled as everything from EMS Piano to Piano and EMS, the project is named very literally, with the EMS Synthy AKS and the piano being the main instruments. Both are pictured in Brian's home studio on the cover, and as with other side projects, it's believed to be largely a Dougans solo affair. So the tracks have been lying around for some time, heard as far back as 2008, but again it was the sad death of Brian's father that pushed him to finally release some. Brian's dad had gifted him the Synthy device after he'd signed to Virgin, so this seemed like a fitting tribute. The initial vision for the project came after Brian bought a baby grand piano, as seen on the cover, and envisioned a mixture of electronics and classical piano music. Dan Pemberton was brought in for sessions, although Brian began to play on his own to contribute to further tracks and include his performances that appear on all the pieces here. The piano itself has since gone on to feature regularly on FSOL releases, such as on Views tracks and the more recent piano pieces. FSOL Digital describes the EP as recorded to 1/4-inch tape, warm and saturated. EMS Piano used exactly what's on the tin to create this 3-track EP, taken from the album Vessels. With a name like One and the announced album, there was hope of more material in the years since the EP's release, but nothing has been heard since, and with the launch of the Synthy A project, it seems the Synthy has a new home on FSOL Digital. 3 unreleased tracks, Vessel, Warm Drift and an untitled piece, have been heard on Electric Brainstorms. This is a big shame, as not only the music here is lovely, but also with 3 very different sounding tracks running to a mere 12 minutes, it feels very incomplete, like a project that would work far better at album length. Here's hoping Brian returns to the project at least one day, although with the EP not even making it over to Bandcamp, it does seem like EMS Piano has fallen off the radar. Grazing Part 1. A warm summer's day in the British countryside is the picture painted by this EMS Piano track, with a rather literal title. Grazing sheep are heard bleating throughout, with warm major key piano melodies over the top. The Synthy is limited to just a gentle percussive sound that comes through once in a while. A very pretty rural track, and one that first appeared on Electric Brainstorms Volume 6. Swimmer. More warm piano chords and electronics on this piece, the only one on the One EP not to have been heard prior to release on an Electric Brainstorm mix. Here the Synthy is in full force, adding melancholic pads, gentle sweeps and bursts of chaotic noise to fill out the track with unusual and appealing textures. The Suitcase. Very much on the EMS end of EMS Piano, this electronic piece dates back to at least 2008, with its first appearance on Electric Brainstorms 2. On that mix, the electronic pulses and sweeps were joined by the flute-like loop heard in Serengeti, which intriguingly reappears on this EP version. While no piano appears, there are plenty of odd bleeps and bloops from the synthy, snippets of spoken word and some birdsong to keep the track interesting. Sand Sound Folly, Salient Moons 1973. Release date 1st of August 2013. The Sand Sound Folly project made its first appearance in 2011 on Electric Brainstorm 7, with a Silent Moon then advertised to be from the forthcoming Salient Moons LP. Sadly, the resulting record turned out to just be 4 tracks. Everything about this project fits in with the increasingly acoustic-leaning hauntology, analogue synths and folk music approach of the EBS mixes and side projects of the FSOL digital era, and even Environments 4. From the 1973 of the title to the rustic-looking artwork, and of course the music itself. Described on FSOL Digital as recorded live at the Pan Vision Gallery, 3rd of April 2010, there's at least a little artistic license at play here, and not just because of the fact that there's no actual band to perform the music with this many instruments. As with most of the side projects, the official line is that it's largely the project of Brian. There's also the matter of there being no such place as the Pan Vision Gallery. I absolutely love this little record and really wish it had been the full album. Probably the least electronic sounding work produced by either Brian or Gaz, Salient Moons 1973 is a record of acoustic instrumental jams, live drums, piano, violin, acoustic guitar, electric piano, flute and double bass, with a scattering of synths and electronic noises over the top for good measure. It certainly sounds like it could be the work of a live band. The atmosphere is completely in line with the hauntological direction of many FSOL digital projects, recalling the soundtrack to a 1970s horror film. Pleasingly, all 4 tracks are joined by environments. A hugely and very unfairly overlooked project that remains in obscurity due to it not being added to the FSOL Bandcamp page. One to definitely check out if you haven't already. A Silent Moon. First out on Electric Brainstorm 7 and fitting in with that mix is melancholic rural feel. A Silent Moon is one of my favourite tracks in the whole FSOL catalogue. Opening on a beautiful electric piano arpeggio, the piece goes on to include sparse percussion, tambourine, booming toms, the occasional cymbals, acoustic guitar fingerpicking, a flute melody and some haunting violin notes. For a piece that's largely the result of one musician, it's quite remarkable how much it sounds like a live band, the looseness in the drums in particular feeling like an improvised jazz fusion performance. A suitably rural field recording environment with birdsong, a babbling brook, some synthy sweeps closes the track leading into the next piece. Wishbone. While retaining a certain wistfulness, Wishbone is the most optimistic sounding piece on Salient Moons, with bright piano chords and a gentle skipping jazzy drum beat. What sounds like mellotron strings play a quiet improvisation in the background, and guitar textures burst in and out. It ends on a minute-long environment with layers of synthy noise and some oddly banging drums. Willow. Willow starts on water splashes, continuing the rustic feel, followed by more live-sounding percussion, either toms or even more ethnic drums, as well as a syncopated shaker line. Cello notes and odd scraping noises orbit the main thrust, while a Spanish guitar plays a snaky lead melody. It's more sinister than the preceding 2 tracks, and always brings to mind something ritualistic and pagan for me. It closes on vinyl crackle. Ebb and Flow. Ebb and Flow continues the sinister, ritualistic sound of Willow, with a dark, hypnotic acoustic guitar riff, bongo-like percussion, bass guitar improvisation, and bizarre metallic sounds. Reversed electric guitar notes and a high-pitched synth oscillation eventually come in, leading the track to a crescendo. A closing environment of vinyl crackle, running water, and a quiet field recording of spoken voices closes the EP on an ambiguous but dark note. Suburban Domestic, Stillness. Release date 1st of August 2013. An unexpected one-off side project, Suburban Domestic creates electronic dub music. Although ever so well it included subtle elements of dub in the past, especially with some of the deep bass lines, as a style it remained largely unexplored, other than the forgettable Stereo MCs remix, until this release. Appearing on FSL Digital with no credits or liner notes at all, it's generally considered to be largely the work of Brian. The artist name is inspired by a family argument from Brian's childhood. I've never been the biggest dub fan or particularly fond of single genre releases, so the EP remains one of my least listened to in the band's catalogue. That said, there's a particular darkness and the usual FSL reverb that make it fairly atmospheric. The faded monochrome cover photo featuring Brian's art teacher from school continues the 1970s aesthetic from the era. Stillness. Stillness's title track sets out the album's sound and mood from the word go, big clattering drum lines, deep dub bass, syncopated synth stabs and dark brooding atmospherics. Dub is often the soundtrack to exotic psychedelic imagery, especially with its links to Jamaica and marijuana. This is a very different sound, however, one of squats in concrete tower blocks and danger around every corner. It later appeared on a Controlled Vista 2.7. Suburban Domestic. More deep industrial tinged dub bleakness, with a stop-start beat that refuses to ever resolve into a proper groove, some dark piano notes, a lone-sounding harmonica, and electric guitar improvisation. Another spacious and atmospheric piece, although one that's maybe a touch too long, running to 7 minutes. Despite the amount of effects, everything seems to be plunged through at various points. Naked Earth. With fewer dub archetypes, no syncopated stabs or bouncing bassline, Naked Earth feels more closely connected with other FSOL digital era releases, with a similarly cold atmosphere to releases from Blackhill Transmitter and Parts Submerged. The main focus is on squirming, gurgling synth textures which overlay the piece and change throughout. Pleasure Doing Business With You. A more upbeat track than the rest of the EP, Pleasure Doing Business With You opens with a sample of someone speaking the title, pitched up, and features a quirky bassline, flute melodies, spy-themed guitar, brass samples, and a much faster tempo than the other Suburban Domestic tracks. There's still an element of darkness and a ton of reverb, but it runs closer to more traditional dub than a lot of the EP. Municipal Infrastructure. Opening with a classic reggae drum fill, Municipal Infrastructure delves deeper into dub with an incredibly low sub-bass line, layers of cavernous reverb and delay on the drums, and a slow groove. The title is evocative of the concrete industrial imagery contained in the EP's atmosphere. The track repeatedly resolves into harsh swirling synth oscillations and clattering hi-hats, making it the most intense piece on the record. The Amorphous Androgynous Monstrous Bubble Soundtracks presents The Cartel Volume 1. Release date 11th November 2013 digital, 18th November 2013 CD. It's difficult to know what to say about this one. The Cartel was mentioned as a new Monstrous Bubble release in June 2013, with an official announcement from Gaz in August. He wrote, Cartel Volume 1 is the first release in the new series, Monstrous Bubble Soundtracks, produced and performed by the Amorphous Androgynous. It's a parallel series to the Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble DJ series, but Amorphous Androgynous write and produce all the music in this series, rather than DJ like Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble, exploring subgenres of MPB. The Cartel explores psychsploitation, where blaxploitation meets psych, a psychsploitation soundtrack for bank robberies, car cop chases, heists, gun runners, counter-surveillance, killing sprees and regret. Although announcing Volume 1 there, track lists for 2 volumes were posted. YouTube videos previewing numerous tracks from the 2 albums came along after. Amazon gave an official release date of 2nd December. Typically digital copies turned up on FSOL Digital on 11th of November, with CDs shipping a week later. With recent Monstrous Bubble remixes moving into more danceable, slightly electronic territory, it's perhaps no surprise that the music here is along similar lines. Only some of the tracks feature live drums, with many incorporating breakbeat loops. Unsurprisingly, given the concept, there are no lyrics and only occasional vocals of any kind, which, combined with the breakbeats and frequent use of synths, make both volumes of the Cartel probably the most overtly FSOL sounding Amorphous releases. Ironic then that they are the first to feature Amorphous as producers rather than FSOL. Chaos reigns supreme as ever. One of the stipulations of the project was that it would blend electronics and guitars, to bring Amorphous back round to both Gaz and Brian's creative visions once more. It's also the first Amorphous album to directly relate to an FSOL record, in this case Hide and Speak being later reworked as an FSOL track. They do a pretty good job of capturing the intended mood. There's a sleazy cop movie vibe throughout, with funk elements blending with dramatic orchestration, guitar twangs, sinister vibraphone, groovy Hammond organ and occasional darker, more atmospheric interludes, as well as an unusual dub piece. Typically, having spent several years working back up to the gapless format, almost no tracks here are linked. I suppose it feels more like a conventional soundtrack in that sense. The credits have many points of interest. Firstly, and most intriguingly, almost all the instruments are performed by Brian and Gaz. For instance, only 7 tracks feature guest musicians on bass and guitar, yet almost every track features these instruments. Similarly, almost all the Hammond organ, piano and synth performances are also by the pair. This is by far the most Brian and Gaz heavy Amorphous record by quite some stretch. Only 3 of the Amorphous live band, Virgil Howe, Anthony Argueras and Kerem Gooms, are present on the album, accounting for 6 tracks. Kerem Gooms plays bass, as does a certain Mr. Noel Gallagher. Amusingly, by the time of the album's release, Noel had actually featured on more original Amorphous tracks than the other way round. His presence suggests that some of the album at least was recorded during the Noel and Amorphous album sessions. Raven Bush, Kate Bush's nephew and member of Canterbury's psychedelic band Sid Arthur, is another newcomer, as are Nat Steele, Peter Judge and John Dalton. Most of the performances seem to have been recorded at the individual musicians' studios and pieced together at Brian and Gaz's places. Gaz, alongside the Cowshed, now also works at Le Chateau, his house in rural France. The art is all by Brian's significant other Lisa Bartlett, inspired by 60s movie posters, and the layout is by their manager Graham. The cover features 3 shady looking characters, the middle looking more than a touch like Gaz, the booklet including a drawing of a gun and a smoky cityscape, as well as a photo of Brian and Gaz working in the studio with Noel, a montage of the musicians, and one of Gaz's first person stories, attempting to link together the titles again. It's charmingly naff. Family, musicians and management are all thanked, as well as Mikey Rowe, who, while not performing, is at least mentioned on his first Amorphous recording in quite a few years. The Bandcamp edition features different fonts on the cover to the CD version, because of course it does. CD has an FSOL digital catalogue number, but still manufactured and marketed by Passion Music. The Wasp. Cartel opens with the tense guitar and piano lines of The Wasp, a perfect intro that could easily be the opening theme to a 70s cop show. As harpsichord, zither and layers of synth all mount up, the piece builds to the inevitable crescendo with fast drums from Virgil Howe and a wild guitar from Androgynous. At 4.5 minutes is one of the most fully developed pieces on the album, with violin added near the end. It's another case of everything being thrown at it, but it could easily fit on Alice in Ultraland, especially given that it's one of the few Cartel tracks to feature a full band lineup. The title is a bit of an oddity, possibly the nickname of some gangster. The Bug. The Bug begins with pizzicato strings, adding the suggestion of a sneaky underground operation. Virgil Howe offers a steady drum beat, and Kesgoons throws in a Peter Gunn theme-esque bassline. A trumpet theme follows. There's a definite 50s PI feel to the track, unlike the sleazier 70s vibe to a lot of the album. The pizzicato strings also feature on the track The Costa Rican Cartel. Banksters. I've never personally seen a 70s cop film with a reggae soundtrack, but it's not a movie genre I'm overly familiar with. Maybe it happened. Syncopated Hammond organ, deep dubby bass and clattering drums from Virgil Howe are the main draw here. The opening guitar riff and additional bass parts are played by Noel Gallagher in his first appearance on an Amorphous track. As with a lot of the Cartel material, elements reappear in other tracks. Some are organ in Regrets and Last Respects, bass in The Plaza Heist, and the whole piece is reworked as Skanksters. Regrets and Last Respects. Opening with a watery sounding synth, Regrets and Last Respects brings the mood of the Cartel down to a more melancholic territory, fitting in with the title. Vibraphone and Alicia Sufit's vocals add texture and feeling to this intro section. Drums come in, either sampled or played by Brian, over which Hammond organ lines from Banksters are played. Harp and trumpet, synths and guitars all play over the top in a subdued manner somewhat unlike a lot of Amorphous material from this period. And then there are electronics and a saxophone riff which would later find their way onto Environment 5's opening and closing tracks, the first sign of FSOL and Amorphous feeding into each other. Indeed, this could easily have been released as an FSOL piece without anyone blinking an eye. Further reworkings of the track include Regrets and An Ocean of Regret. Being a sucker for melancholic stuff, this has always been a favourite of mine, unsurprisingly. The Chase. Fairly self-explanatory title of this fast-paced, tense-sounding piece built around a repetitive guitar riff, strings, a bouncy breakbeat and synthy AKS squelches. Harpsichord and flute feed into the 70s sound, while a breakdown in the middle, with layers of reverse sounds and synths, keeps the electronic approach up front. The second half features reverse guitar solo. Peter Judge is the only guest player on the track. Hide and Speak. Another brooding, atmospheric piece opening with guitar and harp arpeggios. Hide and Speak is maybe best known to FSOL fans as an alternate take of Environment 5's Images of the Past, with the two tracks sharing harp, string and flute sounds. Peter Judge's flugelhorn plays the main theme on this version of the track. Loaded Silence Part 1. An odd interlude of mangled brass and string samples. The piece exists in a more fleshed out version as Loaded Silence, while the bass line recurs in Dead Man's Shadow. It crossfades with the following track. Plaza Heist. A bit of a strange one with scattered improvisation from numerous instruments floating around over jazzy electric piano chords, a loose drum beat that starts and stops, and Noel Gallagher's bass line, also heard on Banksters and Skanksters. There's a sleazy jazz feel to the piece, and the lazy mood doesn't fit the more action-packed concept suggested by the title. A couple of saxophone notes from Regrets and Last Respects appear and would later be used in FSOL's Point of Departure. Eyes and Ears to the Ground. With a bouncy, percussive rhythm, Looped acoustic bass, scraped strings, plucked piano strings, weird electric bass noises and ticking clock samples, Eyes and Ears to the Ground feels closer to something from Yage's The Woodlands of Old than anything on the Cartel. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it's low on collaborative musicians with only Nat Steele's barely audible vibraphone present. The first billion is the hardest. After some more abstract, slightly electronic pieces, the Cartel returns to full-on throw every instrument at it Amorphous territory for the first billion is the hardest. Fast breaks, fuzz bass, Hammond, brass, flute, guitar, strings, vibraphone and synths battle it out in a typical Amorphous freak-out. Among the reused sounds is a string sample from the band's remix of Noel Gallagher's aka What a Life. Where does the evil go when evil men die? Opening with subtle electronics and the album's recurring clock sample, things move quickly into a bizarrely chopped up drum loop, brass samples, a sinister plucked instrument sample and layers of electronics. A dark, threatening sounding track, unlike anything else on the Cartel. The warmer tones of the intro return for the end. Radio Breakdown. Another breakbeat piece, Radio Breakdown is one of the few Amorphous tracks to feature no credited guest musicians at all. Layers of scuzzy guitar are the main focus of the piece, with synth chords coming through in the second half. Taken Delivery. Pure film scores are often comprised largely of short pieces created for individual moments and scenes, and Taken Delivery is one of the few tracks on the Cartel to feel like a genuine soundtrack piece in that regard. Fairly abstract but very atmospheric, with shakers, bells, dark string chords and a repeated flute motif, it could almost have come from one of the more acoustic-leaning side projects like the San Monte tapes or Salient Moons 1973. A lovely evocative piece. It crossfades into the next track. The Harry Limescale theme. With a title parodying the Harry Lime theme from The Third Man, the Harry Limescale theme is based around a Hammond organ riff composed by Rainey Moore, here joined by a few other instruments. A fully fleshed out version of the theme exists as the Killin' Spree theme from Harry Limescale. Down the Memory Hole. Down the Memory Hole is the longest Cartel track by some stretch, reaching over 5 minutes, and is one of the few to incorporate the funkier side of the 70s film soundtracks that influenced the project. Instead of simply jamming around the theme, however, Brian and Gaz throw in some traditional FSOL structures, with elements coming and going throughout, even trailing off into moments of ambience. A wah-wah guitar riff plays the main theme throughout, initially over a slow rhythm with double-speed drums coming in later. A single wailing guitar note sounding like an owl's hoot is looped in the second half, adding some strange tension. Choir samples appear briefly and the tracks fade out. The Rat. One of the most authentic film score sounding pieces on the Cartel, The Rat is a brief ominous piece led by scraping strings and rattling dulcimer notes with a subtle breakbeat in the background. The dark and atmospheric track is one of the few Amorphous tracks to feature no guest musicians. Unsurprisingly, it sounds like it could be honed on an FSOL album or one by an FSOL Digital Era side project. Never Trust a Grass. The Cartel Volume 1 closes on one of its more electronic pieces with a slow drum loop, dark synth chords, a theremin-esque synth melody, growling electronics and occasional flute samples. Some 70s proggy sounding Hammond organ and a trumpet melody come in for the second half, bringing things back to a slightly more Amorphous territory. The Amorphous Androgynous Monstrous Bubble Soundtracks presents the Cartel Volume 2. Release date 11th of November 2013 digital and 18th November 2013 CD. Released at the same time as the Cartel Volume 1, Volume 2 isn't just more of the same. Several tracks utilise the same sounds as pieces from the first volume, and some are very much alternate takes, Banksters and Skanksters for example, but Volume 2 is by far the more electronic of the two, with fewer live drums and more in the way of darker, more atmospheric tracks. There are far fewer guest performances, with many pieces just consisting of Brian and Gaz, with contributions from Nat Steele and Peter Judge. This makes it feel much more like an actual soundtrack with a more consistently moody feel, shorter pieces and sparser production being more suited to inclusion in films. The line-up's largely the same, although without Anthony Aguirre's guitar shredding, and the art is pleasingly consistent, down to the same inner spread collage, although a different shot of the pair in the studio with Noel is included. There is the question of why these were released as two separate albums as opposed to a double album. The two volumes do have somewhat different sounds, with the first being generally more upbeat and sounding like a band, and the second more electronic, atmospheric and FSOL-ish, but with so much crossover material it's odd to have them as two fully separate releases. I do think it would make more sense musically and in terms of fan purchases for the two to be released as a straightforward 2 CD release. They were initially also released as a double album pack with a card sleeve around them, of course. Both volumes of the Cartel went down pretty well with fans, even those who tend to be more wary of Amorphous. Undoubtedly the instrumental nature of the music, as well as more incorporation of electronics, loops and samples, added to the appeal, and the intentional focus on creating a specific atmosphere also helps. Having had some, occasionally very vocal, reservations about some of the post-isness Amorphous material, I don't have anything negative to say about the Cartel. I think it's an intriguing project, generally pulled off very well. The first volume is something I don't really listen to, largely because it's quite a step away from what I want from either Amorphous or FSOL, although when I do listen to it I find myself enjoying it, but those times only ever seem to be while I'm writing about it for something or other online, largely because I'm just never really in the mood to listen to something that sounds like the soundtrack to a 70s action film. The darker, more electronic feel to Volume 2, however, is right up my street, frequently falling into a similar murky category as other FSOL digital era releases like The Woodlands of Old, Salient Moons 1973, An Open Window, and the San Monte tapes. The two albums were promoted with a mix on Solid Steel Radio, and talk of a remix album popped up regularly. Many of the tracks were reworked for use on library music collections, fittingly for an album of imaginary soundtrack pieces. The Monstrous Bubble soundtrack concept has fallen aside since 2013, which is a shame as I think there's a lot of potential. It turns out it was considered largely a one-off project. The name does exist as a potentially open-ended series, but the likelihood of future volumes is sadly slim. I've been hoping for a Wicker Man-esque album of creepy folk horror from them ever since, possibly with an FSOL volume of 70s hauntology synth music to go alongside it. Hopefully one day the series will return, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Watching the Watcher. Watching the Watcher acts as an intro to the following track, with ominous piano notes, a sinister sax riff, booming percussion, and some cheap-sounding string samples. An atmospheric, if somewhat strange, intro to the second volume of the Cartel. The Watcher. With ska-like syncopated guitar chops and brass, The Watcher is a fairly upbeat track. Other than the catchy brass melodies, the rest of the instrumentation is performed by Brian and Gaz, and it's fittingly less clogged with improvisation than your average Amorphous track. It reuses many riffs and themes from its intro piece, Watching the Watcher, itself directly reprised in the final 40 seconds. An Ocean of Regret. The second piece in the Regrets series, this reprises the vocals, synths, strings and saxophone from Regrets and Last Respects without that piece's rhythmic elements. With its modern classical sound it could easily be an FSOL track, and indeed, much like Regrets and Last Respects, it shares a saxophone riff with Environment 5's Point of Departure and Moments of Isolation. It's a sound rarely heard on post-2005 Amorphous releases, and another crossover between the project and FSOL. A beautiful melancholic piece. Hombre Malo. Hombre Malo? I don't know how to pronounce that. An unusually lo-fi sounding Cartel track with very roomy sounding drums and a flat guitar line, as well as a Hammond organ solo and some hushed vocal samples. Interestingly, given this soloing and instrumentation, this is 100% Dougans and Cobain, with no guest musicians at all. It would later go on to form the backing track of Where Does the Evil Go? The Visitor. With sinister harp samples, a murky bass and drum loop and a very dark, sinister feel, The Visitor is another Cartel track that could easily fit on Yage's Woodlands of Old. Peter Judge's muted trumpet lends the track a darkly jazzy feel. Loaded Silence. Another of the darker, more atmospheric tracks from the Cartel, Loaded Silence is an extended and more fleshed out version of Loaded Silence Part 1 with scratchy violins, squelching synths, harpsichords and backing drones, a wonderfully sinister and strange piece of music. Skanksters. After a run of largely Brian and Gaz centred atmospheric pieces, the Cartel band lineup returns on this fractured reworking of Banksters. The original is fed through a huge bank of effects, coming out the other side as a slice of experimental dub, as opposed to the 70s reggae sound of the original. 20 Years Behind Bars. a darkly jazzy piece based around brushed acoustic drums, Hammond organ and vibraphone improvisation. The Killing Spree theme from Harry Limescale. Reprising the Harry Limescale theme, the Killing Spree builds up Rainy Moore's Hammond theme into a somewhat whimsical piece with odd percussion, descending acoustic bass and bizarre electronic effects, continuing the stranger and more electronic mood of the second volume of the Cartel. "1 Million Stashed", an atmospheric piece by Brian and Gaz alone with a loose, jazzy drum beat, guitar feedback and growling synth and organ notes. There's a nocturnal feel to the piece, although the guitar melody that comes in during the second half is more optimistic than the first half darker mood. Dead Vapours, a brief atmospheric burst of synth noise that feels more like a closing atmosphere to an FSOL track than anything Amorphous, although the sinister feeling matches the darker tone of most of the Cartel Volume 2. Tap Up, odd percussion, dulcimer notes, acoustic bass, scratchy violin and background atmospherics place Tap Up in the easily to compare to the woodlands of old territory once again. The piece has an odd structure with sounds regularly coming and going, the whole track cutting to silence on several occasions, and it's hard to identify electronic noises are enjoyably bizarre. Billion Breaks. A remix of the first Billion is the hardest, with a ton more effects and a generally more electronic sound. That said, the chaotic nature of the track feels slightly at odds with the more stripped back sound of Volume 2. The Decision. A lo-fi piece for solo piano with plenty of tape wow and flutter. It sounds a lot like the one heard on EMS Piano, and as such is probably a Brian solo track. A beautiful melancholic interlude. Tunnel Sequence. Tunnel Sequence opens with a fast synth sequence over which live drums and echoing flute notes are placed. A chase through a tunnel is certainly suggested by the mood, although the usual Cartel Volume 2 stripped back sound makes it feel like a slightly more laid back chase than ones often seen in films. Layers of voices, metallic clangs and other bizarre noises appear over the top, adding intriguing textures to the piece. The main synth sequence might be more familiar to FSOL fans as part of Environment 6's Tunnel North 5, another example of the two projects being interlinked. Dead Man's Shadow. Using the bass from Loaded Silence as well as live drums and muted trumpet, Dead Man's Shadow is another brief, stripped-back jazzy piece. What sounds like a puffing steam train appears briefly halfway through. The Costa Rican Cartel. A brief atmospheric piece featuring the pizzicato strings from The Bug, utilised in a much creepier manner. Cook the Books. A weirdly plodding beat and quirky synth open this strange whimsical piece. Creepy horror film organ joins in, bringing in more Woodlands of Old atmospherics. Thin sounding strings and scratchy synths add further weirdness. Peter Judge is credited for trumpet, but it seems to be the same performance as heard in 1993 and 94 ISDN transmissions, in part at least, strangely. Gunrunners. A 3-note bass riff, fast percussion, vibraphone improvisation and flute and string samples thrown in at various points are the main focus of this atmospheric piece. There's even a classic FSOL style sample pitched down an octave moment near the end. Sometime Later. A fitting title for a postscript to the main Cartel album. Lo-fi percussion, twangy guitar, beautiful harp plucks, gentle brass chords and wordless vocals complete this collection of pensive, atmospheric soundtrack pieces perfectly. The Amorphous Androgynous, the Cartel Volume 1 and 2. A limited number of copies of the Cartel Volume 1 and 2 were sold through FSOL Digital with an exclusive slipcase on the first release of the albums. They sold out fairly quickly, although an MP3 edition of both albums can still be purchased from FSOL Digital. The Amorphous Androgynous, Solid Steel Radio Cartel Mix, 22nd of November 2013. The second Amorphous mix for Solid Steel, this show was broadcast a few days after the CD editions of the Cartel started shipping from FSOL Digital and was created to promote the albums. It opens with police sirens and a sample from American Gangster, Everybody's Stealing, Dealing, followed by Watching the Watcher. More sirens and speech follows, and it's the Wasp incorporating the "alright, let's get the fuck out of here" sample as previously heard at the start of Exchanged. The whole mix is interspersed with spoken samples, foley, gunshots and other noises from largely unidentified 70s movies. Don't let her dominate you, be yourself, come out with your hands up, and so on. The following track is by the Howard Robert Orchestra and supposedly called Heatwave, although I can't find reference to said track anywhere online. It's not an FSOL mix without at least one tracklist error. The track is a 70s library music piece featuring American cops shouting over the middle. Billion Breaks is chopped and glitched in the middle before going into an extended outro section, followed by elements of the track slowed down dramatically as a kind of weird environment. There's more American Gangster to close the track. Regrets and Last Respects ends on the usual Amorphous Rook calls, which have been in regular rotation for over a decade by this point. The second and final outside piece is from Jacques Brel, whose Knocker Les Zout goes through the usual Dougans Cobain mangling with some bits slowed down and various effects added. There's dialogue between two characters from the 1994 film The Shadow, and then a run of more atmospheric pieces follows with Tap Up and Tunnel Sequence. You're the One Who Looked Me Up last year is a dialogue sample from an episode of classic crime drama Kojak. After another unidentified spoken sample, the final piece is The Bug, followed by some classic monstrous psychedelic bubble sample, "Hey what's up man, how you doing?" and some violin to fade. The mix was made available to download to Solid Steel subscribers following the broadcast and has since been shared amongst fans, from which the tracklist is taken. It can still be listened to on the Solid Steel SoundCloud page. 2013 remixes and compilation tracks. The Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble remix continued into 2013 with yet another remix. Meanwhile, the first fully fleshed out original FSOL compilation exclusive track was released in the form of Lakeside on the very first Touched Music release. Andy Cato, the Coastal Path Amorphous Androgynous MPB mix. Now, come on, that's some lazy titling. Even ignoring the lack of definite article in the band name, literally abbreviating Monstrous Psychedelic Bubble to MPB hardly helps promote the track, does it? Andy Cato is one half of middle-class coffee table bland tronica act Groove Armada, who released his debut solo album in 2013. From it, one digital single was released featuring remixes by Biosphere and the Amorphous Androgynous. After a run of multi-part, genre-bending, sidelong epics, the Monstrous Bubble mix here feels strangely underwhelming, running to less than 8 minutes. Before I go any further, it's worth mentioning that this is not a remix of the Coastal Path, but one of Florence to Rome. The two tracks are musically unrelated. No idea how that happened. Anyway, the main synth riff from the original is replicated by fuzzy bass guitar and Hammond organ, which play over an incredibly energetic drum performance with guitars and flutes and the like going mad over the top. It's your usual Monstrous Bubble mix affair. A break for bongos, some Hammond improv, swirling analogue synths providing a touch of electronics. It actually retains a little of the multi-part structure despite its length. In the middle, guitars fade away to allow synths and vocals from the original through, the track taking a sudden melancholic turn. More synth lines are added and it could almost be an FSOL track for a while. The band gradually returns with some flute freak-out going on at the track's climax, and then it fades out rather abruptly. After a few seconds of silence, a brief flute and synth reprise comes in for the final 40 seconds. Of all the Monstrous Bubble mixes to date, this is by far the strangest. The original is very much a synth pop track, and the choice of having it remixed in the psychedelic jam band style is quite bizarre. It might also be the first time I don't think they improved on the original. Cato's track is quite a pleasant if remarkable little song, but this remix does very little for me at all. Due to its digital release, there are no credits, although performances were very likely by the same musicians as the past few remixes. The future sound of London, Lakeside. Touched Music is a label run by Martin Bolton, with all profits going to charity. For the first release, Martin contacted a number of electronic musicians, including big names such as 808 State, Aravane, Kettle and of course FSOL, as well as many artists from the electronic music underground. Enough came through to add up to a 123 track digital compilation, sold at the time for a mere £6. Happily hundreds of people bought it, bringing in huge sums of money for Macmillan cancer support. Once again, returning to the death of Bill Dougans, Brian's father had died of cancer and had been helped out by Macmillan after receiving his diagnosis. When Martin from Touch got in touch about including an FSOL track on a compilation with all proceeds going to the cancer support charity, Brian was immediately on board. This started a lengthy collaboration with Martin and Touch Music, one that continues to this day. FSOL provided 2 tracks to the compilation, including Lizard Crawl, itself having gained sentience and developed a plan to appear on every single FSOL related release known to man. The other, Lakeside, is the first properly fleshed out FSOL compilation track since 1996, Occydate being little more than a brief sketch, and the first to be recorded at least vaguely around its release date since 1995. It opens with the now very familiar sound of water flowing over which a flute plays. This is FSOL in full ambient mode. EMS sounds swirl around, choir samples come in, field recordings are added, it all becomes incredibly textural. Flutes reappear again in the second half, while a large number of sounds from the sample library are liberally strewn over the track. It's not a bad piece, but it does feel more like an extended environment than a fully structured track, the sort of thing that would work brilliantly on an album in the way Ill Flower does, but not as 3 minutes out of context. It's a shame it didn't end up on one of the environments. Still, one can't be too churlish about what was at the time a rare example of something that was described as a new FSOL track. And on that note, that's all of 2013 covered. Thank you for watching. I would love to read your comments down below. What do you think about this music? Do you like the Cartel? Have you heard all these side projects? Do leave me a comment. Also like, subscribe, share, you know the usual stuff. I will be back next week to look at the first releases of 2014, and I really hope you'll join me then. First Blackhill Transmitter EP returns to rhythms with TX DSO's Stage 1. Stage? A fairly self-explanatory title for this fast-paced synth